preparing for and installing Vue Connection Server. Okay, so in that last nugget, we spent some time talking about the architecture of VMware Vue and really putting on paper all of the different components that need to integrate so that a user can ultimately get connected into their virtual desktop. And I think at this point you should kind of recognize that there really are quite a few moving parts that are required in order to make that happen. Now, Vue Connection Server, as you probably already know, is in many ways the central nervous system for VMware Vue. It is the server that facilitates when users come in and request desktops. It facilitates getting those users connected up to the right ones. And we'll be spending a lot of our time on that Vue Connection Server, working with the Vue administration tools to create those desktop pools and populate them with virtual desktops and all the stuff that's required for daily administration of this VDI infrastructure. What we've got to do first, however, is to get the whole thing installed. And even before that, we have to prepare Active Directory for Vue Connection Server to be a part of this infrastructure. So in this nugget, we're going to spend some time actually talking about the whole preparation task. There are honestly not that many things, and the things that we are going to do are in many ways optional, but I think explaining them now will help you recognize why we need to almost set our virtual desktops apart from the other physical desktops and servers that are in your Active Directory domain. So in this nugget, we're going to spend some time talking about Active Directory. We're going to create at least one global group, and we're going to create a couple of organizational units and even a group policy that will help populate that group correctly on all of our virtual desktops. You will find that VMware Vue on the client and on the server side has a surprising number of group policy integrations. And there are a number of custom ADM files that you can choose to use for enforcing certain configurations, again, both at the client and at the server side. We also want to talk a little bit about some of the installation prerequisites and requirements, the things you just have to have in order to get the whole thing up and running. I don't want to spend too much time here. If you are taking the exam, it's good to have that list of prerequisites and requirements kind of in your brain. These are typical exam questions just across the enormity of IT exams everywhere. If you're planning on just installing Vue and you're taking this nugget, the series of nuggets in order to improve your knowledge of Vue, well, maybe the installation prerequisites and requirements are not as important. You will find that most of them are pretty standard stuff for all of the different services that we install in IT. What I really want you to recognize out of this nugget is that there's a connection server, and then there are multiple connection servers, okay, replica connection servers. And in this environment, we're going to deal with just a single connection server. Okay, at a minimum, we have to have one connection server that gets the users pointed to the right desktop. But in a production environment, it's important to have that as a high availability piece of your infrastructure. If you think about it, if every user has to go through a connection server in order to get to their desktop, well, what do you do when you need to patch that connection server? Or if it goes down for some reason? And so having a Vue replica connection server or more than one replica connection server is important to ensure that the loss of one server is not going to impact everybody's abilities to access their desktops. The installation itself of connection server is remarkably uninteresting. You click a couple of buttons and you're good to go. So there's not much to see in terms of the installation. And in fact, the replica installation is even less interesting. Right? We click a couple of buttons and point the replica to the regular connection server, and then everything else just sort of magically occurs. There is some under the covers replication that's going on that keeps those servers roughly in sync. And you don't really need to know that, but you just need to recognize that the way in which you install a replica connection server is almost the same as you would install a regular connection server. So let's spend a minute or two here talking about some of the Active Directory tasks that are required in order to prepare, or the things that are required in order to prepare Active Directory for VMware Vue. Now, what I want to do first here is bring up Active Directory users and computers, and I've got a basic domain here. Okay, this domain is company.pri. Now in this domain, you may have already like a desktop computers OU, you might have a servers OU. This is just the basic right out of the box configuration. And so one of the things that I think is generally a good idea, this is in fact a VMware recommended practice, is to create additional organizational units that are specific to your View desktops. Now why is this important? You think about this. Your View desktops have there are different things that you need to manage for a View desktop than is there for a standard desktop. And so having your View desktops down here as a separate organizational unit allows you to apply group policy to those View desktops in very different ways. Now there are View desktops, and then there are also these things that we think of as linked clone desktops. And if you the decisions that you make with regular View desktops are again going to be different for those that we consider linked clone desktops. So it's a good idea also to create a sub-OU for those linked clone desktops. You don't have to do this, but it's just a good idea. Remember, most of Active Directory and most of your organizational unit structure is there for the application of group policy. And as I said before, VMware View has more than a few group policies that you're going to at least have to be aware of. So separating these out can be a good idea. By doing so, I can have regular sort of manual mode desktops in the root OU, and then those that are linked clone in a sub-OU. You may also, and again this is optional, want to create a third organizational unit for kiosks or View kiosk desktops. Now in all these cases, you notice how I'm removing the protect container from accidental deletion item here. This is more so because there's a lot of dynamics going on in these containers. And so I want to make sure that I have the ability to add and remove the virtual desktops, or that the automations that are facilitating the provisioning of these desktops will have the ability to add and remove anything inside the organizational units. So again, these three OUs we will use throughout this series, but are good location or good separation for you to split out what we think of as our virtual desktops and then linked clone and kiosk desktops from the ones that we're using every day. And there's one more thing we need to do here inside of Active Directory users and computers, and that's simply to create a global group that will identify the users that can access these desktops. So let me click here under New Group, and I'm going to create a group called VMware View Users. Okay, these are the people that are going to have rights to access my virtual desktops. And I'm going to use this group here in just a second. Now, if you think about it, on your average Windows desktop, there is a group that's native to Windows called Remote Desktop Users. And you may be populating this already with domain admins, or maybe it's your IT group or what have you. But there is actually a way that we can use group policy to enforce the contents of that group. Okay? What I want to do is use group policy restricted groups as a mechanism to enforce, well, I want to make sure that the VMware View users are always in the Remote Desktop Users group. So let's go ahead and create a group policy object here. If you've never played with restricted groups inside of group policy, they are honestly one of the most interesting pieces of group policy. Excellent for helping you identify on all the local machines, well, which global groups do I want to make sure are always in that location. So let's call this enforce remote desktop users. Okay, that's the GPO we're creating here. And when I've got that GPO created, I want to edit it and go to Policies and Windows Settings, and then down here under Security Settings. If you haven't been to this before, we're looking for restricted groups, which is right here about in the middle or so. Now, restricted groups, awesome power here. If you have, for example, let's say you have the administrators group on your desktops. I could, with restricted groups, create a group identification here, call it administrators. And from this location, add in, well, wait a minute, I want to make sure that the, that the IT users group is a member of administrators. Or that the, the finance users are a member of administrators. Probably wouldn't want to do that. But this allows me to enforce the membership of specific groups on any of the desktops or servers that this group policy applies to. Let's go here now to the relevant example. Okay, and the group I want to identify is the Remote desktop users. Restricted groups matches these by the item or by the name that we put in. So this needs to be spelled and the right spacing exactly as it would be on the individual desktops. Once you create that, you can then up here in the top identify who should be the members of this group. If I go here to add and browse, I can add in the VMware View Users group to the Remote Desktop Users group. And group policy will now, if I apply this to the right OU, group policy will now enforce that I have the right users, giving them the right access down on the local machine. When I'm done here, I'll just need to move this over to my View Desktops OU, link it up right there, and we're good to go. So these are a couple of the items that you're going to want to do to prepare your Active Directory for the installation of View Connection Server. Again, not all of them are required. Most of them are fairly optional. But what they do is they help create a better management experience as we move forward through this series of nuggets. All right, so Active Directory prepared. Next stop is View Connection Server. And in fact, here I am on this server. This is vcon.company.pri. And on this server, I'm going to want to install the View Connection Server, the bits. Important to recognize here. And this gets very confusing simply because of the naming. I have a View Connection Server. Okay? And then I also have a View Composer Server that we'll deal with a little bit later. The View Connection Server cannot be your vCenter server. Okay? Cannot be your vCenter server. Now, important here is that the View Composer server must be a vCenter server. Okay, so keep those two straight. Whenever you're building out your test environment or even your production, make sure that you separate out the connection server so it's on its own piece of equipment. Here, if I double-click, this is the download, View Connection Server download right off the internet. If I double-click to launch the installation, I will begin installing View Connection Server version 5. As I mentioned before, terrifically uninteresting installation. Okay, choose next here, agree to the license agreement. I choose where I want to install the server to, and then I make my way to the installation options screen you find here. This is the only really interesting screen in the whole installation. It's very important for me to point this out because you'll notice that there are actually 4 types of servers that are installed or that can potentially be installed from this location. The first is the standard server. This is the first connection server in an organization, right? The first instance in a group of servers is going to be your View standard server. Any subsequent servers that are replicating with that first one will be a View replica server. Now, I'm not going to show you how to create that because it's almost exactly the same as a standard server, but just be aware that that's there. The last 2 down here we're going to deal with a little bit later. A View security server is a special type of connection server that exists out in your DMZ. Okay, tends not to be in the domain. Often has multiple network cards, so it bridges from DMZ out to inside. Users connect up to security server. Security server is the kind of the point of embarkation from that outside user to their inside desktop. The last one down here is View Transfer Server, and the only thing you need to be aware of, at least at this point, is the View Transfer Server is used whenever we're using offline mode. Okay, user wants to transfer their online VDI instance to their local computer. Well, they're going to go through a View Transfer Server. So let's go through and install the standard server here. Really the only option worth noting is the firewall configuration. Again, if you're taking the test, make sure you have all these firewall ports memorized because for some reason on every IT exam everywhere, firewall port numbers are really important. But these, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, potentially 6 firewall ports, just put them in your brain. For the rest of us, if we're just building this out, recognize what these ports are. They are required in order to support running View. So we will configure the Windows firewall automatically to support them. Once we're done, we click Install, and this installs that View Connection Server. Okay, this process takes a minute. So while it's going about doing its thing, I'm going to put the recording on pause, and when we come back, I will have the installation complete and ready to go. And we're back. As you can see here, the installer has completed. We're ready to begin working with View Connection Server. I'll click the Finish button here. And I have a new icon up here called View Administrator Console. Double-click, launches Internet Explorer or whatever your browser of choice is, and you'll notice that we have a problem with the website security certificate. Now, you've seen this before. What View has done is install a self-signed certificate that is not trusted by this computer. And so you can go through and choose to trust this certificate. I'm not going to do that at this point. A little later on, in order to facilitate some of the extra security in this environment, we'll deal with some certificate things that will make this go away. But for now, let's just choose to continue to this website so that we can actually log on to View Administrator. Here's my username. I'll punch in my username and password, click the Login button, and you will see, well, here we are at essentially the dashboard. In fact, let me click up here to get to the dashboard for View Administrator. Some very interesting things you're seeing here. Okay, I am seeing up here in the upper left the number of sessions that are currently going on. There is none because there are no virtual machines. And then also some system health icons here. Down here in the lower left, I can choose what pane I want to view. Here on the right, I'm looking at the dashboard right now. Now, this system health item here will give me some very nice heads-up displays about the different components that make up a View infrastructure and whether or not they're healthy or not. I have my server, vcon.company.pra, currently up and running. Great. I have a yellow dot here for the event database, which is showing me that the database has not yet been configured. We'll do that a little later. And then I also down here have the different domains that are, first of all, the domain that I'm actually in right now, company.pri. And then there is one trusted domain, the specialized domain, which is showing a down arrow because, well, the pieces aren't there. And that's okay, right? I'm running this entirely within the company.pri domain. I wanted you to get an opportunity to see what your trusted domains will look like here. Over on the right, I have the desktop status. How are my desktops? Are they prepared, provisioned? Are they problems? Is there some sort of issue going on? Are they actively in the preparation state? And then down on the bottom, some data stores, which we don't have any data yet because we haven't connected up to vCenter server yet. Now, there are a couple of things that we want to set up first here within View Administrator just to get things kind of off to the races. The very first thing here is under Product Licensing and Usage. Now, right out of the box, there is no license set up for View Manager. When there is, well, when you have your license, I guess I should say, and you'll get that from vmware.com, you'll click down here to choose Edit the License. You'll pop in that license serial number, and it will make available all the functionality so that you are properly licensed. As close as we've come this early in this series, I'm just not ready to share my license keys with you. So drop your license key in here, and that will expose all the functionality that you need to get started. I do want to show you down here under Global Settings, there are a number of entries in here that you might want to adjust. These are global settings for this View instance. First of all, what is the session timeout? 600 minutes is the default setting here for how much time I allow a session to occur. Do I want to require SSL for client connections? Okay, that certificate that we saw, that certificate error that we saw, I can get rid of that by unchecking the box. Notice if I do so, smart card authentication is not going to work because I'm not running HTTPS. I can choose to re-authenticate secure tunnel connections after I have an interrupted network. Now, if you're running on a LAN, you're not going to see that many interrupted networks. But if you think about it, if I have external users, maybe they're connecting in over some 3G connection, and maybe a guy's sitting on a train coming into work, he's working on his desktop, train goes into a tunnel, and the network connection drops. Maybe it's a short tunnel. Maybe it drops for just a second or two. If I check this box, when the person comes out of the tunnel, they're going to have to re-authenticate back to get their session again. That can be a good idea from a security perspective, but it can be kind of annoying from a user experience perspective. So you can choose whether or not you want to require that extra re-authentication whenever a person comes in. Now, the different components that make up a View infrastructure have messaging that they use to talk to each other. I can also either require or request message security when those messages are being transported between different components. The require is here for enabled. The request is here for mixed, meaning that I will use message security if the right certificates are in place, but I won't require it if they're not. In this case, I'll choose disabled. Again, this is another security feature there to ensure that the messaging between these servers happens appropriately. Do I want to enable automatic status updates? If I turn this on, then down at the client side, the users are going to see automatic updates associated with their status, but you have to be careful about this because the pushing of that status information down to the client is going to prevent any kind of an idle session timeout from occurring. So you can turn this on and it will give your users a little bit more information, but you are going to have an issue with any of those idle session timeouts. And honestly, having that timeout so that idle sessions can be closed and you can harvest those unused resources back into the pool is a pretty good thing. So you probably want to be cautious about turning this on at this point. Many of us down here have a requirement that users accept some sort of standard use agreement before they access a company resource. If that is you, well, then you can display that pre-logon message here. This is your typical, you agree by using this resource to follow the rules of the company sort of message. And then also, when you force a log off, so when a user is actually required to log off, are you actually going to display some kind of warning and then give them a timeout before you actually log them off? Useful. You don't want to annoy the users if you're trying to do a forced log off in the middle of the day. Many of us won't do that, but if we do, this is the global setting for that. So this is right here. This is mainly the most important pane that we need to worry about for right now. We're going to look at all the other panes here throughout this next series of nuggets. We'll talk about the servers that we want to connect up to, some registered desktop sources here that we'll be working with. These are things like terminal services or other sources. We'll deal with administrators and rights and privileges a little later as well as ThinApp and the event database, and then also that transfer server repository. So these are, again, the very high-level settings for setting up a Vue server. We're not getting very deep here, and not to worry. We will deal with those very deep settings as we slowly build this infrastructure over the next series of nuggets. We do have one final topic that we need to talk about here, and that is the prerequisites and the requirements for getting the services up and running. And again, I don't want to spend too much time here because these prerequisites and requirements are documented very well in this document, the VMware Vue installation guide. Make sure you have the right version. That's very important. In this guide, in Chapter 1, are going to be all those requirements that you need for the servers that will make up this infrastructure. Okay, this is system requirements for server components. A couple of things I want to point out here. You can run connection server on server 2003 R2 or 2008 R2. Notice recommended of 4 CPUs and a single gigabit NIC here. And then also the memory, at least 10 gigs of RAM for deployments of 50 or more Vue desktops if you're running 2008 R2. Okay, that's for the Vue connection server hardware. Again, software down here, Windows Server 2008, Windows Server 2003. No database requirements. Okay, we'll deal with database requirements when we get to Composer, but here for connection server, no database requirements. Another thing to take notice here is the virtualization software requirements for Vue connection server. Supports 4.0 U3, 4.1 U1, and vSphere version 5. Okay, and again, I'm not going to spend much time here. If you're taking the exam, you're going to want to know these. If you're building your environment, just make sure that you've got all of the basic requirements here to support all the different transfer server and composer server and connection server. That's really what you need to be aware of here, is to spend a lot of time with this Vue installation guide. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about preparing for and installing the Vue connection server. We spent a pretty decent amount of time sort of introducing the Active Directory and group policy concepts. And there are a couple of things that you just have to have up and running for Vue connection server to work. Spent a minute with the installation requirements and prerequisites, and then talked about the important differences between a connection server and a replica connection server down here. Upon concluding that, then we went through and actually clicked a few buttons. We prepared Active Directory for a Vue installation and went through the installation and the initial configuration of that Vue connection server. Coming up in the next nugget, then we're going to start with our virtual machines and actually creating those virtual machines and preparing them for delivery using this Vue connection server. So for now, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.